Margaret stood barefoot in the golden field, watching the sun sink low behind distant hills, and she wondered how her life had brought her to this moment. Standing before a stranger's ranch with nowhere else to go, the old pickup truck that had carried her thus far sat broken down to miles back along the dusty road, and she had walked until her feet ached and her throat burned with thirst. She was 53 years old, and everything she owned fit into one small suitcase that now sat beside that useless truck. The rancher appeared almost like a mirage at first, walking toward her with a horse trailing behind him, and his weathered face showed neither surprise nor judgment when he saw her standing there looking lost and defeated. He was perhaps 60, with silver hair beneath a wide-brimmed hat and eyes that had seen enough of life to understand that sometimes people end up in places they never expected. Without a word, he offered her his canteen, and she drank gratefully while he waited patiently as if he had all the time in the world. His name was Thomas, and he had owned this ranch for 30 years after inheriting it from his father, who had worked the land. Before him, Margaret tried to explain her situation with halting words about a divorce that had left her with nothing and adult children who had their own lives now, and a series of poor decisions that had led her. Hidemar simply nodded and said the bunkhouse had a spare room if she needed a place to stay for the night. That first night she lay awake on clean sheets in a small room that smelled of cedar and prairie grass, and she cried quietly for the life she had lost and the uncertain future that stretched before her. When morning came, Thomas knocked gently on her door and told her breakfast was ready if she was hungry. They sat at a simple wooden table in his kitchen, and he made scrambled eggs and toast while telling her about the ranch and the work that needed doing. He did not pry into her past or offer unwanted advice, and she found his quiet presence somehow comforting. After breakfast, he showed her around the property and explained that he could use help with the horses and general upkeep if she wanted to stay on for a while in exchange for room and board. Margaret had never worked on a ranch before, but something in her said yes before her mind could talk her out of it. The first week was harder than anything she had done in years, with muscles she did not know she had crying out in protest and her soft hands developing blisters that turned to calluses. Thomas was patient and kind, showing her how to feed the horses and muck out stalls and mend fences without making her feel foolish for not knowing. In the evenings they would sit on his porch and watch the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple while sipping coffee and talking about small things. He told her about his wife Sarah, who had passed away 5 years earlier from cancer, and how the ranch felt too big and too quiet without her. Margaret shared stories about her marriage and how she had lost herself somewhere along the way, trying to be what everyone else needed instead of discovering who she really was. One night, about 3 weeks after she arrived, a terrible storm rolled across the plains with lightning splitting the sky and thunder shaking the foundations of the house. Margaret woke to the sound of the horses screaming in fear, and she rushed outside in her nightgown and bare feet. Without thinking, Thomas was already in the barn trying to calm the animals, and together they worked through the night, speaking in soothing voices and gentle touches until the storm passed. When dawn finally came, they stood exhausted and muddy, looking at each other, and something shifted between them in that moment. The second time came a month later, when Thomas fell from a ladder while repairing the barn roof and landed hard on his shoulder. Margaret heard his cry and ran faster than she knew she could and found him lying in the dirt trying to catch his breath. She helped him into the house and called the doctor, and spent the afternoon holding ice to his bruised shoulder and making him rest despite his protests that work needed doing. Looked up at her with gratitude and something else in his eyes, and said he did not know what he would have done without her. There that evening she made dinner for them both, and they ate slowly, talking about their childhoods and dreams they had once held. Thomas spoke of wanting to travel when he was young and see the ocean, but life had kept him rooted to this land. Margaret confessed she had always wanted to paint, but had convinced herself she had no talent and let that dream fade away. Asked why she could not start now, and she said she supposed there was no good reason except fear, though. Next week, Thomas surprised her with art supplies he had driven into town to buy, and he set up an easel for her near the window with the best light. Mark felt something warm bloom in her chest at his thoughtfulness, and she realized it had been years since anyone had truly seen her as more than a wife or mother or bird. And she began painting in the mornings before the work of the day began, capturing the endless sky and rolling fields and the horses grazing in golden light. Thomas would stand quietly watching sometimes, and his presence never felt intrusive, but rather like he was witnessing something sacred. The third time happened on a cool autumn evening when they had worked all day bringing the horses in from the far pasture. They were tired and covered in dust, and Margaret had twisted her ankle stepping in a hidden hole. Thomas carried her back to the house despite her protests and his own aching back, and he sat her down and carefully wrapped her ankle while kneeling before her. His hands were gentle and sure, and when he looked up at her, something passed between them that needed no words. Margaret reached out and touched his weathered face, and he leaned into her palm and closed his eyes. They stayed like that for a long moment, both of them afraid to break the spell. Later that night after dinner, Thomas asked if she would like to take a walk, and she said yes, even though her ankle throbbed. They walked slowly through the moonlit fields, and he told her that having her there had brought life back to the ranch and to him. Margaret said she had found something here she did not know she was looking for, and that was a sense of home. Stopped walking and turned to face her and asked if she might consider staying, not as hired help but as his partner in life. He said he knew it might seem too soon and they were both carrying wounds from the past, but he had learned that life was too short to let chances slip away. Margaret felt tears stream down her face, and she nodded yes, because for the first time in years she felt seen and valued and loved for who she truly was. They married quietly in the spring with just a few neighbors as witnesses, and Margaret wore a simple dress she had made herself. Her children came to visit eventually, and they seemed surprised to find their mother happy and whole in a way they had never seen before. Thomas welcomed them warmly and showed them around the ranch, and Margaret felt proud introducing them to this good man who had saved her without ever making her feel like she needed saving. The years that followed were not always easy, because life on a ranch never is, but they were filled with purpose and partnership. Margaret continued to paint, and her work began to sell at a small gallery in town, and Thomas would beam with pride when people admired her art. They worked side by side every day, caring for the animals and the land and each other. In the evenings they still sat on the porch watching sunsets and talking, or sometimes just sitting in comfortable silence. Margaret thought often about that day she had arrived broken and lost, and how Thomas had offered her kindness without asking for anything in return. Those 3 times in one night during the storm, when they calmed the horses together, and when he fell and she cared for him, and when he wrapped her injured ankle, had shown her what real partnership looked like. It was not grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but rather quiet acts of service and being present in moments of need. Thomas taught her that it was never too late to start over, and that home was not a place but rather a feeling of belonging with another person. Margaret learned that she was stronger than she had ever known, and that accepting help was not weakness but wisdom. They grew old together on that ranch, watching seasons change and grandchildren visit and life unfold in ways neither had expected. When people asked Margaret how she found happiness later in life, she always said it found her when she stopped running and allowed herself to be still. She would tell them about a kind rancher who saw a lost woman standing in his field and offered her water and shelter and eventually his heart. And she would say that sometimes the best things come not when we are searching, but when we are simply open to receiving grace. Thomas would add that he was the lucky one because Margaret had brought color and warmth back into his world when he had resigned himself to loneliness. They understood that love in middle age was different from youthful passion, but no less profound. It was built on mutual respect and shared work, and the knowledge that time was precious and should not be wasted. Margaret never regretted the path that brought her to that ranch, even though it had been painful and difficult. Every mistake and heartbreak had led her to exactly where she needed to be. She painted that truth over and over in her art, depicting the vast prairie sky and the sturdy ranch house and the gentleman who had changed everything. And when she looked at Thomas across the dinner table or working beside her in the barn, she felt grateful beyond words, because he had given her 3 gifts that night, and in all the days after. First, he had shown her kindness without judgment. When she was at her lowest. Second, he had given